across Alaska, there are places where records thin out, timelines fracture, and events settle into uncertainty rather than resolution. From abandoned settlements and silent coastlines to aircraft routes that never returned clear answers, these accounts do not form a single story so much as a pattern of unresolved moments preserved in fragments of documentation and memory. Each case carries its own circumstances, yet all share a common condition, something observed, recorded, and never fully explained. As this investigation unfolds, you're brought into those fragments as they are reconstructed from official reports, environmental records, and scattered eyewitness accounts tied to remote terrain, unstable weather systems, and isolated movement corridors. What you will encounter is not a sequence of answers, but a gradual exposure to where certainty begins to break down in real time, leaving you positioned at the edge of each unresolved moment as it is examined and left open. The vanishing of Flight 739. In the early 1960s, Alaska stood at the frontier of the Cold War. Aircraft crossed its skies carrying troops, cargo, and diplomatic urgency between North America and Asia, while radar stations watched distant horizons for threats that might never come. The state's mountains, oceans, and weather had always been dangerous, but modern aviation had created the belief that distance could now be mastered. In March of 1962, that confidence was shaken when Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 disappeared over the Gulf of Alaska and left behind one of the region's most enduring mysteries. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-1 1049H Super Constellation, a long-range four-engine transport known for its elegant triple tail and transoceanic capability. By then, Flying Tiger Line had built a reputation as an experienced cargo and charter carrier, with roots in wartime aviation and extensive military contracts. It was not an unknown company improvising dangerous routes, but a respected operator trusted to move personnel across great distances. That reputation only deepened the shock when one of its aircraft vanished completely. On board were 93 United States Army soldiers, 3 South Vietnamese military personnel, and a crew of 11. In total, 107 people were aboard. Many of the soldiers were young men bound for assignments in Southeast Asia, as American involvement in the region continued to grow. Some had recently said goodbye to wives, parents, or children, expecting months overseas before a safe return. Instead, their journey would become a mystery before it had properly begun. The flight had originated in California and progressed westward through scheduled stops before reaching Anchorage. In that era, Anchorage was more than a northern city surrounded by snow and mountain walls. It was one of the busiest strategic refueling points on Earth, positioned almost perfectly between continents. Military charters, passenger aircraft, and cargo transports moved through its runways day and night. Crews studied Pacific weather charts beneath fluorescent briefing room lights, aware that beyond Alaska lay some of the most isolated airspace in the world. After refueling, Flight 739 departed Anchorage on March 16, 1962, bound for Adak in the Aleutian Islands before continuing westward. The route led over the Gulf of Alaska, a region whose beauty concealed persistent danger. Even experienced pilots respected those waters. Storm systems formed quickly, turbulence could rise without warning, and freezing conditions were capable of turning minor problems into fatal emergencies. At night, the ocean below became a black surface without horizon or depth. Initial communication after departure gave no clear sign of trouble. Reports indicated the aircraft was proceeding normally. There was no known distress call, no request to divert, and no final message suggesting panic in the cockpit. Then, somewhere southwest of the Alaskan mainland, radio contact ceased. Repeated attempts to re-establish communication brought only silence. A plane carrying more than 100 people had disappeared between routine transmissions. The search that followed became one of the largest then attempted in the North Pacific. US military aircraft, Canadian assets, and surface vessels were directed into the area. Search crews scanned immense stretches of water for oil slicks, floating luggage, life rafts, bodies, or fragments of aluminum reflecting sunlight. They covered tens of thousands of square miles under difficult conditions. Yet despite the scale of the operation, nothing conclusive was found. One report soon drew attention. A civilian tanker operating in the region stated that those aboard had seen a bright flash or explosion in the sky Around the time Flight 739 was believed to have vanished, investigators could not ignore such testimony. If accurate, it might have suggested an in-flight breakup or onboard blast. But no debris field was found beneath the reported location, and no recovered evidence confirmed what had been seen. Whether the witnesses observed the destruction of the aircraft, a separate phenomenon, or a mistaken impression in the darkness was never resolved. Mechanical failure remained one possible explanation. Though advanced for its time, the Super Constellation was a complex piston-engine aircraft, requiring careful maintenance and constant attention from the crew. Engine fires, electrical faults, structural failure, or sudden decompression were conceivable scenarios. A catastrophic malfunction over open ocean at night could have unfolded too quickly for a radio call. Yet without wreckage, investigators had no engines to inspect, no instruments to read, and no physical clues from the airframe itself. Sabotage also entered discussion, shaped by the tense politics of the era. The passengers included military personnel travelling during a period defined by espionage fears, proxy conflicts, and global suspicion. If an explosive device had been placed aboard, the sudden loss of contact might be explained. But suspicion is not evidence. No fragments, residue, or remains were ever recovered to support the theory. Like many Cold War mysteries, possibility survived where proof could not. The weather was another silent suspect. The Gulf of Alaska is notorious for low-pressure systems, violent winds, icing, and rough seas. Even if the aircraft had managed a controlled ditching, survival time in near-freezing water would have been brief. Searchers also knew that floating debris does not remain where it falls. Currents can scatter wreckage across vast distances within hours, while waves and storms can drag lighter material beneath the surface or bury it in foam and drift. Modern readers often assume that aircraft are continuously visible and precisely tracked. In 1962, oceanic aviation was different. Radar coverage over remote water was limited, satellite tracking did not exist, and navigational reporting relied heavily on radio position updates. Once contact was lost, the exact location of the aircraft became uncertain almost immediately. Searchers were not looking at a marked point on a digital map, but at a widening zone of possibilities over hostile water. For the families, uncertainty became its own form of punishment. There were names and official notifications, but no recovered remains and no final account of what had happened in those last moments. Some families waited for years with private hope that some clue might emerge from a fisherman's net, a drifting raft, or a later expedition. Nothing came. Flight 739 soon gained a grim distinction as one of the deadliest disappearances involving a civilian charter aircraft. Many aviation disasters are eventually reduced to facts: coordinates, wreckage analysis, technical causes, and final reports. This case resisted every stage of that process. There was no cratered mountainside, no visible impact scar, no fuselage on a reef, and no confirmed fragment that could speak for the lost aircraft. Decades have passed, and the Gulf of Alaska still guards its answer. Advances in sonar and deepwater search technology have solved other long-buried losses, yet the seafloor beneath that route is vast, broken, and difficult to survey. Trenches, slopes, sediment, and relentless weather continue to hide what earlier searchers could not find. Alaska holds many stories of disappearance shaped by wilderness and distance, but few are as stark as this one. A full aircraft, an experienced crew, a routine route, and then nothing. Somewhere beyond the last radio call, the silence of Flight 739 remains unbroken. The ghost blips of the Alaska Triangle. On maps of Alaska, space can be more deceptive than crowded cities, and within the broad lines linking Anchorage, Juneau, and Utqiagvik lies the region now called the Alaska Triangle. It is not an official boundary, nor a marked zone recognized by law or science, but a modern name given to a pattern of disappearances that has unsettled residents for decades. Aircraft have failed to arrive, travellers have gone missing, and search efforts have often ended with no clear answer. In a state already defined by wilderness, this unsolved Alaskan mystery grew from the places where evidence never returned. Across this northern landscape, disappearance is often helped by terrain long before mystery is ever mentioned. Alaska contains mountain ranges large enough to create their own weather, forests that stretch for hundreds of miles, rivers that shift with thaw and flood, and glaciers capable of swallowing wreckage beneath moving ice. winter darkness can last for long hours, while summer distance can deceive even experienced travellers who believe help is closer than it is. A person lost in many regions might be found by road, fence line, or nearby town. In much of Alaska, there may be nothing nearby at all. Above the forests, glaciers, and coastal ranges, aircraft have long served as ordinary transportation in places roads never reached. Small planes, bush pilots, and regional flights are woven into daily life in a way unfamiliar to much of the world. Mail, medical supplies, workers, and families have often depended on aircraft the way others depend on highways. That necessity also brings risk. Rapid weather changes, mountain turbulence, icing, and limited visibility have contributed to numerous accidents across the state. Some wrecks were found quickly, others were discovered years later. A number were never located with certainty. Alaska is also long ranked among the most aviation-dependent regions in the United States, with many communities accessible only by air or water for much of the year. In practical terms, that means more takeoffs into marginal weather, more landings on short or unimproved runways, and more routine flights through a country where emergency options are few. What might be considered an extraordinary journey elsewhere can be ordinary transportation here, repeated daily until one trip fails to return. Few journeys cast a longer shadow than the 1972 flight carrying Hale Boggs, Nick Begich, Russell Brown, and pilot Don Johns. Boggs was the US House Majority Leader, while Begich was Alaska's congressman. Their twin-engine Cessna departed Anchorage for Juneau on October 16th and vanished en route. The search that followed became one of the largest in Alaskan history, involving military aircraft, helicopters, Civil Air Patrol crews, and extensive ground efforts. Thousands of square miles were examined, no confirmed wreckage was found, and no final explanation was ever established. The disappearance of nationally known figures gave the Alaska Triangle story one of its most enduring anchors. Sometimes the stories begin not with wreckage, but with blips said to flicker across radar screens and then dissolve. Over the years, pilots, dispatchers, and local storytellers have repeated accounts of aircraft signals that changed direction abruptly, faded in clear conditions, or vanished before contact could be restored. Many of these reports are anecdotal and difficult to verify in official records, yet they remain part of the Triangle's folklore. Radar in mountainous regions can be affected by terrain masking, weather interference, and limitations of older systems. Even so, unexplained losses on a screen possess a particular power because they suggest something present one moment and absent the next. Before satellite navigation became common, pilots in remote northern regions relied heavily on radio aids, charts, weather judgment, and visual references whenever conditions allowed. In a mountainous country, those references could disappear quickly behind clouds, snow, or darkness. Even with skill and experience, navigation in Alaska has often demanded constant correction rather than simple straight-line travel, and small uncertainties can grow large over empty land. Numbers have also fed the legend because Alaska has for years reported high rates of missing persons compared with much of the United States. Those statistics are shaped by many realities: isolated communities, harsh exposure conditions, transient workforces, substance abuse, domestic violence, accidents, and the sheer difficulty of searches in a remote country. Many missing people are later found safe, while others are located after tragic delays. Yet unresolved cases remain, and when names accumulate faster than answers, statistics begin to feel less like data and more like a warning. Even the first hours of a search can be uncertain. Reports may arrive late from distant camps or villages, weather can ground aircraft needed for rescue, and initial locations are sometimes based on estimates rather than exact coordinates. By the time organised efforts begin, a traveller may have moved, snow may have fallen, or tides may have altered the scene entirely. Where documented evidence becomes thin, older fears and newer theories quickly move in to occupy the silence. Stories of hidden forces in the wilderness, strange lights over mountains, unknown creatures, and openings to other worlds have all been attached to the Triangle. Some accounts borrow from broader American UFO culture, while others draw loosely from local traditions and cautionary tales about dangerous land. Most of these claims cannot be tested, and many were amplified by television, books, and the internet. But legends do not need proof to survive. They need only an unanswered space. Search crews understand that wilderness can hide the obvious with startling efficiency. A downed aircraft may disappear beneath snowfall within hours. A dense spruce canopy can conceal twisted metal from the air. Glacial crevasses can entomb debris and move it over time. Tidal flats can erase footprints, while rivers can carry clothing or equipment far from the place it mattered most. In some regions, storms ground rescue aircraft just when the first critical hours are passing. Cases that appear impossible from a distance can begin with ordinary misfortune and end in unrecoverable terrain. Perhaps the lasting power of the Alaska Triangle comes from how ordinary explanations and unanswered losses exist side by side. There is no need to imagine supernatural laws to understand why people vanish in Alaska. Geography, weather, risk, and isolation already provide severe answers. Yet that practical truth does not erase the discomfort of cases with no wreckage, no witness, no final coordinates, and no certainty. Human beings are unsettled not only by danger but by incomplete stories. The triangle, therefore, exists in two forms at once. One is physical, a vast region of mountains, sea routes, forests, and skies where mistakes can become fatal quickly. The other is psychological, a map drawn from unresolved disappearances, each one adding another point to a shape people cannot stop tracing. Every time a plane is overdue or a hiker fails to return, the legend is mentioned again, and the boundary grows darker. Inside those vast boundaries, many last known locations remain the beginning rather than the end. The murder of Arlis Perry in the Far North Connection. Born in North Dakota in 1955, Arlis Perry's name would later become tied to a case in California that challenged how distance and memory shape the understanding of violent crime. Her death on October 12, 1974, inside Stanford Memorial Church in Stanford, California, would be documented in police records, forensic reports, and decades of renewed analysis. Yet it would also remain part of a wider public uncertainty that persisted long after the initial investigation had ended. In discussions of unsolved cases, her story often appears not because of where she was from, but because of how long it took for parts of the truth to surface. Inside Stanford Memorial Church on the morning of October 12, 1974, the stillness of a sacred space was disrupted in a way that would later be documented in one of the most examined crime scenes of its time. The church itself, located on the Stanford University campus, was known for its architectural prominence and open access, a place where visitors could enter during the day without significant restriction. It was in this setting that Arlis Perry was found deceased, and the discovery immediately shifted the location from a place of quiet reflection to one of active forensic scrutiny. What investigators initially encountered in the hours and days following the discovery was not clarity, but a shifting set of interpretations that changed as each detail was examined more closely. Early stages of the investigation were conducted under the constraints of 1970s forensic practice, when many techniques now considered standard were either limited or entirely unavailable. Investigators relied heavily on physical observation, witness statements, and scene reconstruction, which meant that conclusions were often shaped by interpretation as much as by scientific certainty. As a result, early theories evolved repeatedly as new details were reassessed under changing investigative perspectives. Nearly 4 decades later, developments in forensic science would bring renewed attention to evidence that had remained dormant through multiple generations of investigation. Advances in DNA analysis allowed materials collected from earlier decades to be re-examined under conditions that did not exist in the 1970s. In 2018, authorities announced the arrest of Stephen Blake Crawford in connection with the case, based in part on DNA evidence that linked him to the crime scene, a development that significantly altered the historical trajectory of the investigation, while also raising new procedural questions about how long resolution can take to emerge in cold cases. In cases where technology evolves faster than legal resolution, earlier assumptions are often revisited under conditions that did not exist when the first inquiries began. Cold cases are not simply reopened by narrative interest alone, but through formal legal and procedural thresholds, often triggered when new forensic tools become available or when previously untested evidence can be re-examined with improved accuracy. This means that an investigation may remain technically open for decades, while simultaneously accumulating new scientific clarity that only later becomes actionable in a courtroom setting. Legal records and investigative archives from cold cases often reveal that the term unsolved can persist even when fragments of resolution exist in parallel. A case may remain open in a formal sense while simultaneously progressing through incremental stages of clarification where certain evidentiary questions are answered while others remain constrained by legal standards of proof. This layered condition creates a situation in which investigation, prosecution, and public understanding do not always move at the same pace, producing gaps between what is known scientifically and what is recognized legally. Over time, public understanding of long-running cases can drift away from procedural reality, shaped instead by the gaps left between confirmed findings. In the absence of immediate resolution, narratives tend to form around what is missing rather than what has been established, and those narratives often solidify during the long periods when no major updates are available. As years pass, the original investigative context can become less visible, replaced by later interpretations that emphasize uncertainty, delay, or contradiction, even when portions of the case record have since been clarified. Within that distance between origin and outcome, narratives can form that emphasize absence as much as documented fact. Even when official records contain detailed findings, the passage of time can alter how those findings are perceived, especially when early investigative ambiguity remains part of the historical record. In such cases, understanding is shaped not only by evidence itself, but by the intervals in which evidence was unavailable, untested, or not yet fully understood within the limits of the technology of its time. The evolution of forensic science during the late 20th and early 21st centuries added a new layer to how older cases are interpreted. Techniques such as DNA profiling, database matching, and improved trace evidence analysis allowed investigators to revisit cases that had remained static for decades. These advancements did not rewrite the original events, but they did expand the boundaries of what could be proven, narrowing uncertainties that once defined entire investigations and allowing some cases to move from ambiguity toward resolution after long periods of stagnation. In long-term investigations, the passage of decades often introduces a quiet shift in how certainty is defined. What once appeared entirely unresolved may later be partially clarified through scientific advancement, yet remain open in public perception due to the complexity of legal thresholds and the time required for formal adjudication. This creates a layered condition in which resolution is not a single moment, but a gradual process distributed across years of evolving evidence and interpretation. The Arlis Perry case exists within that layered condition, where documented developments and lingering questions occupy the same historical space without fully reconciling. The factual record includes investigative milestones and later forensic breakthroughs, yet the broader cultural memory of the case continues to reflect the long period in which answers were absent. Even the physical setting of the original investigation reflects how quickly a location can shift from ordinary use to forensic focus, and how that shift leaves behind a record that is interpreted differently as investigative methods change. What was once examined through observation alone is now often revisited through technological lenses that can extract information from traces previously considered insignificant or unusable. What remains behind is not only what was never known, but what could only be understood long after it was first recorded. The missing village of Portlock. Along the southern coastline of the Kenai Peninsula, historical records place the small settlement of Portlock, a community that once functioned within Alaska's early fishing and cannery network, before gradually fading from regular habitation. Established within a period when coastal Alaska saw scattered industrial expansion tied to seafood processing and seasonal labour, Portlock existed as part of a wider pattern of small, service-dependent settlements that emerged where natural resources could be temporarily harnessed but not permanently stabilised. Its location on the edge of Chugach National Forest and the waters of the Gulf of Alaska placed it within a region defined by access and isolation in equal measure, where maritime routes provided connection only as long as weather permitted passage. In later retellings of Alaskan history, Portlock would become associated with one of the state's quieter unresolved mysteries, not through a single documented disaster, but through the question of why a functioning settlement was ultimately abandoned. What once functioned as a remote but operational coastal settlement depended heavily on maritime supply routes that were vulnerable to weather patterns capable of isolating entire communities for weeks at a time. Ships carrying provisions, equipment and personnel were the lifeline of places like Portlock, where roads did not extend and overland access remained impractical across rugged terrain. In Alaska's coastal regions, even seasonal daylight variation shaped logistics, influencing when deliveries could safely occur and how long operations could be sustained without interruption. When storms intensified across the Gulf of Alaska, even scheduled shipments could be delayed indefinitely, leaving settlements to rely on stored resources and planning cycles that determined survival as much as economics. During the early decades of the 20th century, documented accounts suggest that Portlock maintained periods of activity tied to seasonal industry, even as logistical strain began to shape its long-term viability. Like many small Alaskan coastal settlements, its existence was closely linked to the fluctuations of fishing operations and resource extraction, industries that often expanded quickly and contracted just as rapidly when conditions shifted. Census records and historical references place it among communities that were active but fragile, sustained by narrow economic margins and dependent on continuity that remote geography rarely guaranteed. In later oral histories recorded years after its decline, accounts emerged describing increasing unease among residents, often centered around conditions in the surrounding wilderness that were difficult to verify through surviving official records. These accounts vary in detail and originate largely from retrospective storytelling rather than contemporaneous documentation, but they contributed to the growing association between Portlock and unexplained local fear. What remains consistent across many versions is not a single defining incident, but the suggestion that environmental and psychological pressures began to accumulate in ways that made continued habitation less sustainable. By the time permanent withdrawal began, the process reflected a gradual reduction in presence rather than a single recorded moment of evacuation. In many remote Alaskan settlements, abandonment historically followed a similar pattern, where families and workers relocated in stages toward larger, more accessible coastal towns as services consolidated and economic opportunities shifted elsewhere. What is often described as abandonment in archival terms is, in practice, a slow reorganization of population and infrastructure across broader regional systems, leaving smaller locations progressively underused until maintenance and occupation could no longer be justified. In regions where supply chains depend entirely on weather-permitting access, environmental pressure often determines not only how long a settlement survives, but how quickly it becomes impractical to maintain. Coastal storms, shifting tides, and extended periods of isolation can transform routine logistics into irregular and uncertain operations. Over time, even well-planned settlements can face compounding difficulties as repair cycles lengthen, transport becomes less reliable, and essential goods arrive inconsistently, gradually reshaping what daily life in such locations can realistically support. Historical photographs and residual records from abandoned Alaskan settlements often reveal how quickly human-built structures begin to deteriorate once regular maintenance ceases. Wooden frameworks absorb moisture, roofing weakens under persistent precipitation, and coastal air accelerates corrosion of exposed materials. In Portlock's case, as with many similarly situated settlements, the absence of sustained upkeep would have allowed natural forces to reclaim built environments within relatively short spans of time, leaving behind structures that gradually lose their function and definition. After abandonment, interpretations of places like Portlock tend to form through fragmented memory, later documentation, and the narratives that emerge when direct testimony becomes limited. As decades pass, the boundary between recorded history and oral tradition can shift, especially in regions where population density is low and archival material is sparse. In this space between documentation and recollection, stories are preserved not always through formal records, but through repeated retelling, where emphasis can shift subtly with each generation. In many such cases, what remains unclear is not the departure itself, but the exact combination of factors that made it seem inevitable. Environmental strain, economic decline, and logistical difficulty each form part of the broader historical context, yet the exact weight of each factor is often difficult to reconstruct with full precision. In remote settlements, where records may be incomplete or scattered, the absence of a definitive explanation can leave room for interpretations that extend beyond what surviving evidence can fully support. As Portlock became less frequently occupied, its physical presence began to recede from active maps of daily use, transitioning from a living settlement into a historical reference point. Over time, locations like this are often reclassified in records as abandoned or former settlements, marking the administrative end of habitation even as the physical landscape continues to exist unchanged in its geography. Beyond material decay, such places also produce an interpretive space that emerges as human activity withdraws and explanation becomes incomplete. In the case of Portlock, later accounts layered additional meaning onto the absence, blending historical record with recollection in ways that make precise reconstruction more complex. The shoreline still exists, but the reason it was once quietly left behind does not sit in any single record. The deaths at Lake Iliamna. The waters of southwestern Alaska hold one of the state's largest inland bodies, Lake Iliamna, a vast and remote expanse where reports of disappearances and unusual incidents have long been loosely associated with its shifting surface and isolated shoreline. Stretching across the Alaska Peninsula region, the lake occupies a landscape shaped by volcanic geology, seasonal extremes, and limited permanent settlement, where human presence remains secondary to environmental scale. In discussions of Alaska's mysteries, it is often mentioned not as a single site of incident, but as a place where separate accounts appear to converge without ever forming a complete explanation. Among freshwater systems of this magnitude, environmental conditions can shift with little warning, as wind patterns, depth variations, and sudden weather changes interact across an expanse that resists simple observation. Lake Iliamna is known for strong surface winds that can build rapidly, creating rough water conditions that complicate navigation even for experienced boaters. Seasonal transitions also affect visibility and access, as freezing conditions alter shoreline movement and thaw periods reshape the edges of inlets and bays. In such environments, perception itself can become unstable, with distance and depth often misleading even under relatively calm conditions. Access to the region remains heavily dependent on aviation and watercraft, with float planes and small aircraft frequently serving as the primary means of travel between settlements and remote points around the lake. In practice, this means that movement across Iliamna is often constrained by weather windows where fog, wind shear, or sudden storm activity can delay departures or force diversions. Emergency response in such environments is also inherently delayed, as the nearest coordinated search resources may be hours away by air, and initial reported positions over water can shift or be imprecise once conditions change. Along the remote shoreline communities and scattered access points surrounding the lake, human activity has historically been tied to seasonal fishing, transport routes, and limited aviation access across terrain that remains difficult to traverse consistently. Small settlements and fishing operations have long relied on the lake's resources, particularly its salmon populations, which support both subsistence and commercial activity during peak seasons. Aircraft and boats remain essential for movement across the region, reinforcing a pattern of dependence on systems that are highly sensitive to weather and timing. In recorded accounts from the broader Iliamna region, references to accidents and missing persons appear intermittently, though often separated by time, circumstance, and varying levels of documentation. Some involve aviation incidents in surrounding terrain, while others relate to travel by boat or overland routes, where conditions can change quickly and visibility is limited. In many cases, official records confirm the difficulty of recovery operations in such environments, where cold water, depth variation, and remote geography reduce the likelihood of rapid resolution. From a search and recovery perspective, large lake environments present challenges that differ fundamentally from terrestrial investigations, particularly when depth, sediment, and temperature conditions reduce visibility and long-term trace retention. Cold fresh water can slow decomposition and alter how materials settle, while underwater terrain may conceal objects beneath layers of silt or uneven lakebed structures. Even with modern sonar technology, large-scale aquatic searches require extensive time and resources, and results can remain incomplete when targets are not immediately located. Within local storytelling traditions and later popular interpretations, Lake Iliamna has occasionally been linked to descriptions of unidentified large aquatic life, though such accounts remain anecdotal and unverified within scientific records. These narratives vary widely in detail and origin, often emerging from fishing communities, travel accounts, or second-hand retellings that developed over time. While they are not supported by consistent biological evidence, They have become part of the lake's broader cultural identity, reflecting how uncertainty tends to accumulate in environments where direct observation is limited. Under shifting atmospheric and surface conditions, large bodies of water can produce visual distortions and acoustic reflections that complicate the interpretation of observed phenomena. Waves, glare, and weather-driven surface movement can alter perception across long distances, while underwater acoustics can bend or scatter sound in ways that create misleading impressions of movement or depth. Even experienced observers may find that scale disrupts judgment, as distances across open water can appear compressed or expanded, depending on light, weather, and horizon stability. Across multiple decades of recorded activity, incidents in and around the lake do not form a single consistent pattern, but rather a series of isolated events separated by context and explanation. This fragmentation makes it difficult to connect individual cases into a unified narrative, as each occurrence is shaped by its own circumstances, environmental conditions, and available documentation. What remains is a collection of accounts that resist consolidation into a single explanatory framework. From an analytical perspective, expansive natural environments often retain traces of events unevenly, allowing some outcomes to be reconstructed while others dissolve beyond recoverable evidence. In regions like Iliamna, where water depth, sediment movement, and seasonal variation interact continuously, the physical record of an event may persist in altered or inaccessible forms, limiting the scope of verification even when an incident is known to have occurred. This creates a structural gap between occurrence and reconstruction that is inherent to the environment itself. The lake, therefore, exists not only as a geographical feature, but as a system where observation, memory, and recovery operate under different constraints. What is seen from the surface does not always reflect what lies beneath, and what is recorded in fragments does not always combine into clarity. Over time, this separation between visible activity and recoverable evidence becomes part of how the lake is understood. Beneath the surface, distance continues without reference to what once passed above it. The lost colony of St. Matthew Island. Ecological records place St. Matthew Island deep within the Bering Sea as an isolated Arctic landmass, where a mid-20th century reindeer introduction later became one of Alaska's most closely studied population collapses. The island exists within ecological literature as a controlled case study of what occurs when a large mammal population is introduced into a completely isolated system, where environmental limits and resource availability operate without external ecological buffering. Over time, it became a reference point for understanding how quickly balance can shift when a closed environment is placed under sustained biological pressure without natural regulation mechanisms. The absence of human settlement on the island further intensified its value as a near-isolated observational environment, allowing long-term ecological outcomes to be studied without interference from infrastructure or continuous human activity. Conditions across this section of the Bering Sea are defined by persistent wind exposure, extended seasonal darkness, and biological cycles constrained by extreme limits of recovery and regeneration. These conditions create a narrow ecological window in which plant growth, grazing pressure, and seasonal survival are tightly interlinked, leaving little margin for sustained imbalance without long-term consequences. Vegetation on the island follows slow regenerative cycles, meaning that even moderate grazing pressure can accumulate effects across multiple seasons before visible degradation becomes apparent. This delay between cause and visible effect is a key factor in how ecological instability developed, as early indicators of stress remained subtle and distributed across the landscape. A controlled ecological initiative conducted in mid-20th century Alaska introduced reindeer onto St. Matthew Island, removing them from natural predators in an attempt to observe isolated population growth. The herd was transported into an environment where no competing large herbivores existed, establishing a closed system in which population change could be observed without external ecological interference. This isolation created a rare observational condition in which ecological response was shaped almost entirely by internal feedback loops rather than external migration or predation. At the time of introduction, the island's tundra ecosystem was assumed to provide sufficient forage capacity, though long-term regenerative limits were not immediately visible under early survey conditions. What followed in the early observational phase was a rapid expansion of the herd as tundra vegetation provided uninterrupted access to forage across an environment with no competing large herbivores. This phase of growth continued in the absence of predation pressure, creating conditions that initially appeared stable while masking the gradual accumulation of ecological strain. The apparent abundance of forage during early years gave the impression of long-term sustainability, even though regrowth rates in Arctic tundra systems are inherently slow and seasonally restricted. As population density increased, grazing pressure began to exceed localized regenerative capacity, though these changes were distributed unevenly across the island's terrain. Once ecological systems lose external replenishment, consumption begins to define the boundaries of survival, and population growth can shift abruptly into structural resource collapse. In isolated systems, resource depletion does not occur evenly but accelerates once vegetation loss reaches a threshold that prevents regrowth from matching grazing intensity, leading to a rapid shift in population stability. At this point, ecological feedback becomes self-reinforcing as reduced vegetation leads to weaker animal condition, which in turn alters grazing patterns and further destabilizes remaining plant cover. This compounding effect reduces the system's ability to recover even before collapse becomes externally visible. Field studies conducted after the collapse documented a sharp and irreversible population decline, later cited in ecological literature as a clear example of boom and bust dynamics in isolated environments. The decline was observed not as a gradual correction but as a compressed phase of loss following prolonged overconsumption of available forage across the island. Researchers noted that once critical forage thresholds were crossed, the population did not stabilize but instead entered a rapid downward trajectory with limited recovery indicators. Vegetation damage recorded during post-collapse surveys also indicated long-term alteration of plant density in heavily grazed zones. Within island systems cut off from external ecological exchange, recovery processes are limited by geographic isolation, preventing external migration or resource inflow capable of restoring ecological balance once depletion occurs. This structural limitation means that once vegetation and soil systems are altered beyond recovery thresholds, regeneration becomes dependent solely on internal ecological cycles. In the case of St. Matthew Island, the absence of external ecological input ensured that post-collapse conditions stabilized at a lower biological baseline rather than returning to prior equilibrium. This created a persistent environmental shift where recovery did not mean restoration, but adjustment to a reduced ecological state. Over time, scientific interpretation of St. Matthew Island has emphasized how simplified explanations can obscure the layered feedback processes operating within extreme environmental systems. The case is frequently referenced in ecological studies as an example of how population dynamics in closed systems involve multiple interacting variables rather than a single linear cause and effect outcome. Factors such as seasonal timing, forage composition, and growth rates interact in ways that become difficult to isolate once the system has already shifted beyond equilibrium conditions. This complexity has made the island a recurring reference point in ecological modelling of isolated population systems. Across ecological documentation, these events are recorded less as singular failures and more as progressive sequences of environmental constraint, adaptation, and eventual system breakdown. In this framing, the island is understood not through a single moment of collapse, but through a chain of conditions that gradually narrowed the possibility of ecological equilibrium until only instability remained. The record does not present a dramatic endpoint so much as a measured transition through successive stages of imbalance. The final condition is therefore not interpreted as an ending, but as a stabilized state shaped entirely by the limits of the system itself. Nothing in the record marks an ending, only a transition into a different state of balance. The Nome anomalies. Weather-dependent transport and intermittent communication define daily operations in Nome, a coastal Alaskan city where historical records and modern reports continue to document unexplained and inconsistent incidents. The settlement functions within a framework where reliability is shaped less by infrastructure alone and more by the stability of environmental conditions that frequently shift without long-range predictability. In this context, Nome appears not as an isolated anomaly site, but as a working environment where uncertainty repeatedly intersects with routine activity. Operational systems, both public and private, are structured around adaptation rather than stability, with scheduling, routing, and communication continuously adjusted in response to environmental change rather than fixed temporal expectations. Access to the region depends heavily on flight windows and maritime conditions, as the surrounding Bering Sea environment frequently disrupts predictable movement in and out of the settlement. Small aircraft and supply routes form the backbone of connectivity, yet these systems remain vulnerable to sudden changes in visibility, wind intensity, and seasonal storms. As a result, movement into and out of Nome is often governed by short-term environmental assessment rather than fixed scheduling, creating variability in both arrival and departure records. This dependence also affects logistical continuity, as cargo delivery, emergency response planning, and passenger movement all rely on narrow operational margins that can shift within hours depending on atmospheric stability. Rapid expansion during the early gold rush period left Nome with layered infrastructure, where historical construction patterns still influence the structure of the modern city. Mining activity in the early 20th century drew large temporary populations, resulting in a rapid build-out of roads, buildings, and supply networks that were never fully redesigned after the initial surge declined. Elements of this historical expansion remain embedded in the city's layout, creating a physical environment shaped by both continuity and abandonment of earlier development phases. This layering produces a structural complexity in which older transport routes, repurposed buildings, and modern systems coexist within the same constrained geographic corridor. Small aircraft operations serving Nome routinely adjust to shifting visibility and wind conditions, making scheduled travel highly dependent on short-term atmospheric stability. Flights across the region are often planned within narrow operational windows where weather changes can alter routes or delay departures with limited warning. This dependency introduces a structural sensitivity into transport systems, where operational certainty is continuously influenced by environmental variability. In addition, flight coordination often requires repeated reassessment of landing conditions at destination points, particularly when coastal fog, snow, or wind shear reduces ground visibility below safe operational thresholds. Across multiple decades of regional documentation, scattered reports describe unresolved disappearances and incomplete travel outcomes, though no consistent classification links them into a single category of event. These records vary in scope and detail, ranging from aviation-related incidents to overland travel disruptions, each documented under different procedural conditions. The absence of a unified classification has made it difficult to consolidate these accounts into a single explanatory framework. In many cases, records are separated by jurisdictional reporting systems, resulting in fragmented archival trails that require cross-referencing between agencies for partial reconstruction. Radio transmission and signal clarity in Arctic coastal environments are frequently affected by atmospheric disturbances that alter both range and reliability of communication. Variations in ionospheric activity combined with severe weather systems can distort or weaken transmissions, particularly during periods of heightened atmospheric instability. In such conditions, communication records may show intermittent gaps that complicate real-time coordination and post-event reconstruction. These disruptions also influence emergency communication reliability, where delayed or degraded signals can affect both the timing and accuracy of situational reporting. Informal narratives emerging from local accounts often attempt to organize these disruptions into recognizable patterns, despite the absence of consistent supporting evidence. These interpretations develop gradually over time, shaped by repeated exposure to environmental interruptions and logistical uncertainty. While they reflect attempts at coherence, they do not consistently align with verified operational records or documented incident reports. Over time, this divergence creates a parallel interpretive layer in which lived experience and recorded data evolve separately rather than converging. Comparative review of institutional records reveals that most reported incidents lack alignment in timing, environmental conditions, or verified location data. This inconsistency suggests that individual cases often exist independently rather than as part of a connected system of events. Without overlapping structural indicators, each report remains isolated within its own contextual framework. Even when incidents occur within similar seasonal windows, differences in weather systems and reporting delays prevent reliable correlation between cases. Divergence between official documentation and anecdotal reporting has produced parallel interpretations of the same region, each shaped by different levels of observational reliability. Institutional records prioritize verified data points, while informal accounts often preserve observational impressions that lack procedural confirmation. The resulting gap between these sources contributes to long-standing ambiguity in how events are collectively understood. This dual structure effectively creates two parallel histories of the same geographic space, each incomplete in different ways. When environmental instability and infrastructural limits overlap, recorded information fragments into separate streams that resist consolidation into a unified account. This fragmentation is not necessarily indicative of a single underlying cause, but rather a structural effect of operating within a region where observation, communication, and environmental conditions are continuously variable. The result is a documentation environment in which completeness is rarely achieved in real time and must often be reconstructed after a significant delay, if at all. In many cases, response coordination following reported incidents is further complicated by delayed verification, as confirmation must often pass through multiple channels before being formally recorded. This creates a temporal gap between occurrence and documentation, during which environmental conditions may already have shifted significantly. As a result, some official records reflect stabilized reconstructions of events rather than immediate observational conditions, introducing additional layers of interpretive adjustment into final reports. Response systems operating in and around Nome are structured to function under conditions where immediate verification is often impossible, requiring decisions to be made on partial or delayed information. In practical terms, this means that initial reports of incidents are frequently acted upon before full confirmation can be established, particularly when environmental conditions limit further communication. Over time, this creates a procedural layer in which early assumptions are later revised, sometimes significantly, as additional data becomes available through secondary channels. In emergency coordination frameworks, this verification lag introduces a form of temporal separation between reported events and finalized records, where initial field information may differ from archived documentation once conditions stabilize. This process is not unique to Nome, but becomes more pronounced in regions where weather and communication instability repeatedly interrupt continuous observation. As a result, the final version of many recorded events reflects a reconstructed sequence, rather than a direct transmission of real-time conditions. Within this system, records gradually settle into standardized forms after multiple revisions, creating a distinction between early operational awareness and later institutional summaries. This stabilization process reduces ambiguity in archival systems, but also compresses complex multi-stage observational sequences into single consolidated entries. Over time, this contributes further to the divergence between lived accounts, early reports, and finalized documentation. No single record sustains enough continuity to define a unified account of what has been reported in the region. The unsolved death of Cindy Paulson's would-be killer network. The arrest of Robert Hansen resolved many crimes in Alaska, yet it also left enduring questions about how much of the surrounding truth was ever fully uncovered. Convicted after investigators connected him to a series of abductions and murders near Anchorage, Hansen became one of the state's most notorious offenders. His case appeared in legal terms to have reached a clear conclusion. Yet the unsolved Alaskan mystery that persisted afterward concerned not only the crimes themselves, but whether the known record represented the full extent of what had occurred around him. Like many major criminal investigations, the case established a centre of certainty while leaving less visible details unresolved at the edges. Cindy Paulson's escape became the decisive break in the case, providing investigators with a living witness whose account redirected official attention. In June 1983, Paulson reported that Hansen had abducted her, restrained her, and threatened her before she managed to flee. Earlier complaints involving Hansen had not produced the same level of response, but Paulson's testimony, combined with physical evidence and later searches, altered the course of the investigation. Her survival introduced something previous victims could not provide: direct, immediate contradiction to the image Hansen had maintained. It also forced investigators to treat what may once have seemed isolated allegations as part of a larger and more dangerous pattern. Crimes involving abduction, concealment, and repeated movement often depend on routines and preparations that extend beyond the moment violence becomes visible. Hansen was known as an experienced hunter and pilot with access to aircraft and familiarity with remote terrain. Prosecutors argued that he used these skills to isolate victims beyond public view. Such crimes require transportation, timing, weapon access, and confidence in movement across wilderness areas. Even when carried out by one offender, they often rely on systems of predictability that remain invisible until examined after arrest. Alaska's vast geography with large tracts of sparsely monitored land made retrospective reconstruction especially difficult once time had passed. Investigators studying serial offenders frequently revisit whether a known perpetrator acted entirely alone, even when no provable accomplice is ever identified. In many historical cases, this question arises not because evidence confirms partners, but because repeated offending over years can expose unnoticed assistance, tolerated behaviour, or unexamined contacts. In Hansen's case, no court established a criminal network operating beside him. Still, the scale and duration of his crimes led some observers to ask whether every relevant connection had been fully understood, or whether certain surrounding behaviours were never scrutinised beyond the immediate charges. Questions of this kind often survive precisely because the available evidence closes one door while leaving others only partly opened. Unidentified victims remain a persistent issue in homicide investigations, particularly in regions where transient populations and reporting gaps complicate record keeping. Alaska in the late 20th century included seasonal labour movement, vulnerable populations, and large areas where disappearances could be delayed or poorly documented. Investigators linked Hansen to multiple murders, and he confessed to several killings, but criminologists often note that confession totals do not automatically define total victim counts. Some cases remain unresolved not because evidence points clearly to one offender, but because the absence itself leaves no decisive trail. Missing person reports that were never connected, delayed filings, or incomplete identifiers can leave permanent gaps in any final count. For years, Hansen maintained an outward reputation that stood in sharp contrast to the crimes later attributed to him. He operated businesses, lived within the community, and presented a life that many considered ordinary. This contrast between public identity and hidden violence has appeared in numerous criminal investigations, where normalcy can function as camouflage. In Alaska, the discrepancy carried particular force because the environment already encouraged privacy, independence, and distance between neighbours. The image of respectability may not conceal everything on its own, but it can delay suspicion long enough for patterns to continue. Once exposed, that same contrast often deepens public doubt about how much went unnoticed. Not all enabling structures require active participation, as silence, disbelief, and institutional hesitation can preserve concealment for long periods. Investigators and researchers often distinguish between accomplices and passive conditions that allow offenders to persist. Dismissed complaints, assumptions about victims, failures to connect reports, or reluctance to challenge familiar citizens can each create protective gaps without any formal conspiracy. In the Hansen case, criticism has often focused less on hidden partners and more on whether warning signs were taken seriously before Paulson escaped. In that sense, the most consequential network may not have been criminal cooperation, but a pattern of delay. Evidence establishes legal boundaries, but it does not always capture the full operational history surrounding violent offenders. Courts determine charges that can be supported, investigators prioritize solvable counts, and records reflect what can be proven under procedural standards. That process is necessary, yet it can leave peripheral uncertainties unresolved. Questions about unreported encounters, unidentified remains, discarded evidence, or overlooked leads may survive long after conviction. The legal conclusion of a case is not always the final limit of historical understanding. Some uncertainties remain, not because they are dramatic, but because they no longer have a practical path to resolution. Questions continue because the case reached a conviction while leaving broader uncertainties outside the courtroom record. Hansen died in prison in 2014, carrying with him whatever private knowledge was never documented. Files, testimony, and confessions established much, but not everything. For some observers, the most unsettling possibility is not a secret organisation hidden behind the crimes, but the simpler reality that many violent offenders operate within ordinary blind spots for years before anyone forces the pattern into view. When a case closes before every question is answered, speculation often grows in the silence left behind. The centre of the case was identified, but its outer edges never fully came into view. The Dyatlov echo of the Kuskokwim Backcountry. Shelters discovered empty in Alaska's Kuskokwim Backcountry have fueled enduring questions whenever camps appeared abandoned under conditions that suggested an abrupt and unexplained departure. Across remote sections of western Alaska, seasonal camps have long been used for hunting, fishing, trapping and travel, often established far from permanent roads or rapid assistance. When such places are later found vacant, disturbed, or seemingly left in haste, the silence surrounding them can generate comparisons to other wilderness mysteries, even when the underlying circumstances remain uncertain. The unsolved Alaskan mystery tied to these reports is not one famous incident, but a recurring pattern of scenes that appear to preserve disruption without preserving explanation. Over time, the repetition of similar site conditions has created a body of accounts that feel connected in tone, even when they are separated by geography and years. A wilderness camp often preserves the last ordinary actions of its occupants through the placement of tools, bedding, food, and fire materials. Cooking items left near a fire ring, gear arranged for overnight use, wood prepared for later burning, or clothing positioned to dry can all indicate routines that were expected to continue. In remote environments, these small signs carry unusual weight because they may be the only surviving record of human intention. A normal campsite reflects order, and when that order is interrupted, investigators and local searchers often begin reading the scene for clues. Yet, interpretation is always constrained by what survives weather exposure, meaning that even orderly departures can later appear incomplete or disordered. River corridors, wetlands, timber, and winter exposure combine across the Kuskokwim region to create distances that can become dangerous with little warning. Travel in this part of Alaska has historically depended on river routes, snow machines, small aircraft, boats, and foot movement across terrain that changes sharply by season. Freeze up, break up, sudden storms, overflow ice, and low visibility can transform manageable travel into a survival emergency within hours. Because communities are widely spaced, a person in trouble may be far from immediate help even when following familiar routes. In this environment, time itself becomes a variable, where delays in movement or communication can alter the entire structure of what is later understood as a sequence of events. Suspicion tends to emerge when a campsite shows signs that people left without items normally considered essential for survival. Firearms, boots, food stores, navigation tools, weather gear, or transportation equipment are not usually abandoned casually in an isolated country. If these items remain while occupants do not, the scene can suggest confusion, urgency, or an event that interrupted ordinary decision-making. Yet appearances can mislead. Some gear may be damaged, inaccessible, intentionally cached, or left behind during an attempt to return quickly. In remote terrain, survival decisions are often shaped by immediate conditions rather than long-term planning, and what appears inconsistent may have been entirely situational. Snowfall, wind movement, animal traffic, and seasonal thaw can alter physical scenes quickly enough to erase their original sequence. Tracks that once showed direction can fill within minutes under drifting snow or become unreadable after melt and refreeze. Lightweight objects may be scattered, fabric torn, and food stores disturbed by wildlife long after people have gone. Even investigators arriving relatively soon after discovery may be examining a site already reshaped by weather. In the Alaskan backcountry, evidence is often temporary, while interpretation arrives late. This delay between event and observation is one of the defining challenges in reconstructing any remote abandonment. Human beings under cold stress, injury, or fear may make decisions that appear irrational when viewed later from safety. Hypothermia can impair judgment, reduce coordination, and create behavior that seems contradictory to survival. Injury or panic can cause abrupt movement away from shelter, while exhaustion may narrow choices to whatever seems immediately possible. A person navigating darkness, wind, or pain may act according to pressures invisible to later observers. What looks impossible in hindsight may have felt urgent in the moment. These conditions are not unusual in northern environments, but they become difficult to reconstruct once physical evidence has degraded. Comparisons to famous wilderness mysteries often arise when incomplete evidence leaves observers searching for a familiar pattern. The Dyatlov Pass case in Russia became widely known because it combined an abandoned shelter, uncertain movements, and an unresolved cause, creating a template people now apply elsewhere. When Alaskan camps are found empty under strange conditions, the same language often returns. Yet most backcountry cases are shaped by local realities such as weather, terrain, injury risk, and delayed discovery rather than dramatic unknown forces. The comparison persists because unfinished scenes invite borrowed narratives, even when the underlying circumstances are far more ordinary than they first appear. Local recollections and scattered case records indicate that some abandoned site incidents were remembered more clearly than they were ever formally explained. In remote regions, stories of unusual campsites may survive through family memory, village discussion, or search accounts without becoming widely archived public cases. Details can fade, merge, or sharpen over time depending on who retells them. Formal reports, when they exist, may be brief, practical, and focused on immediate response rather than long-term mystery. This creates a gap between remembered atmosphere and documented fact, where the emotional weight of an event outlives the administrative record. Material traces at abandoned backcountry sites often endure longer than any verified account of the events that created them. A collapsed tent frame, rusting stove, scattered tools, or weathered cabin remains may persist for years after names, dates, and circumstances become uncertain. The landscape keeps the physical outline while losing the human sequence that once gave it meaning. In many wilderness mysteries, the surviving objects are not the answer, but the reason questions continue. Over time, these remnants become reference points for interpretation rather than resolution, anchored in place while their context slowly disappears. Investigators may record every object at the site and still not know why it was left behind. The strange lights of Mount Hayes. Repeated aerial observations over Alaska's eastern range have placed Mount Hayes within a persistent cluster of reported luminous phenomena that resist consistent classification. Situated within the Alaska Range, Mount Hayes rises in a region where extreme remoteness limits direct verification and where most visual data originates from distance rather than proximity. Within this context, the unsolved Alaskan mystery associated with the mountain is not defined by a single incident, but by repeated descriptions of light phenomena that emerge across different times, observers, and observational conditions without forming a stable explanatory pattern. Distance and atmospheric separation introduce measurable distortion into any visual interpretation of airborne light phenomena observed in remote mountain regions. In high-latitude environments, the angle of sunlight, prolonged seasonal darkness, and rapid shifts in weather systems all affect how light is perceived at range. What appears as a defined luminous object under one condition may disperse, shift, or vanish entirely under another. Because observation often occurs from far outside the immediate area, the initial perception becomes a filtered version of environmental reality, shaped as much by viewing conditions as by the phenomenon itself. Stratified air density, temperature inversion layers, and ice particle suspension create overlapping optical conditions capable of altering perceived brightness and motion. These layers of atmosphere can refract light in ways that produce unusual visual effects, particularly during periods of rapid temperature change common in interior Alaska. In mountainous regions, where elevation gradients are steep and weather systems move unpredictably, such conditions can combine to produce fleeting anomalies that are difficult to reproduce or measure consistently. The result is an environment where visual certainty is rarely stable for long enough to confirm a single interpretation. Scattered entries from aviation-adjacent observations and civilian sightlines describe intermittent luminous activity without consistent temporal alignment. Pilots operating across interior routes, as well as individuals observing from ground-level positions, have occasionally documented unusual light behavior near the region associated with Mount Hayes. These accounts vary in duration, intensity, and perceived motion, and are recorded under different observational contexts that limit direct comparison. Without synchronized measurement or shared instrumentation, each account exists as an isolated fragment of observation, rather than a connected sequence. Geographic proximity to controlled air corridors and remote flight paths introduces adjacency rather than direct correlation in documented sighting patterns. The Alaska Range lies near several established aviation routes used for both civilian and logistical operations, but proximity alone does not establish causation. Aircraft movement, atmospheric reflection, and terrain interaction can all contribute to visual anomalies that appear near structured flight zones without originating from them. This spatial overlap creates interpretive ambiguity, where unrelated systems occupy the same visual field without necessarily interacting. Repetition of similar descriptions across separated time intervals can generate the appearance of spatial concentration without a confirmed linkage between events. When independent observers report comparable phenomena under different conditions, the human tendency is to group those observations into a shared category. However, in environments where atmospheric variability is high, similar optical effects can recur without a shared origin. This can produce a perceived hotspot effect, not because a single source is repeatedly active, but because the same environmental conditions are capable of producing similar visual outcomes. Instrument-based verification in extreme northern latitudes remains limited by range, calibration drift, and intermittent atmospheric interference. Remote observation systems, when available, must operate across wide temperature ranges and unstable weather patterns that can affect both sensitivity and accuracy. Even when data is recorded, interpretation is often constrained by the absence of corroborating visual confirmation from multiple synchronized sources. As a result, many observations remain partially verified, existing between anecdotal reports and technical measurements without fully resolving into either category. In many documented cases of persistent observational phenomena, the absence of resolution does not eliminate continued reporting, but instead alters how future observations are interpreted. Once a region becomes associated with repeated visual anomalies, later sightings are often measured against prior descriptions rather than against direct baseline conditions. This creates a secondary interpretive layer in which new observations are filtered through accumulated narrative context, even when the physical conditions remain unchanged. Over time, this can strengthen the perceived continuity of a phenomenon without increasing the certainty of its origin. In remote environments such as Alaska's interior ranges, this effect is amplified by the limited availability of long-term, continuous instrumentation. Without persistent monitoring, each new observation begins without a fully defined reference point, meaning that comparison relies heavily on prior human accounts rather than standardized measurement sequences. As a result, the stability of interpretation becomes dependent on documentation history rather than on physical repetition alone. This separation between observation and verification ensures that even consistent atmospheric effects can remain categorically unresolved. Existing records remain distributed across informal aviation notes, observational summaries, and non-standard reporting channels rather than unified classification systems. Unlike structured scientific datasets, these records are often generated incidentally rather than through a dedicated study, resulting in variation in detail, format, and reliability. Some originate from pilot logs, others from personal accounts or secondary summaries, each shaped by different priorities at the time of documentation. The absence of a centralized registry prevents systematic comparison over long periods, leaving each entry isolated within its own archival context. Classification becomes unstable when repeated observation does not converge toward a single measurable explanation. In scientific terms, repeated but non-converging data points do not automatically confirm a singular phenomenon. Instead, they may indicate multiple unrelated processes producing similar effects under shared environmental conditions. In the case of Mount Hayes, this means that luminous reports remain descriptively consistent without becoming diagnostically unified. The persistence of description, without convergence into a single model, is what sustains the uncertainty surrounding the observations. The same phenomenon can persist in description even when no stable explanation ever forms around it. The lost prospectors of the interior. During the boom years that spread across Alaska's interior, the search for gold drew men into regions where map geography quickly gave way to approximation and rumour. Rivers like the Yukon and its vast network of tributaries became the primary arteries of movement, carrying prospectors deeper into terrain that was still being slowly understood by surveyors and traders. Even the earliest systematic mapping efforts, carried out in fragments by the US Geological Survey and military expeditions, often relied on second-hand descriptions from riverboat crews and mining camps. leaving large portions of interior Alaska defined more by inference than precision. Within this expansion of ambition, what later became known as the Lost Prospectors of the Interior emerged as one of the most persistent unsolved Alaskan mysteries, defined not by a single disappearance but by repeated instances of men and small groups who entered remote valleys and were never reliably accounted for again. Their camps were sometimes found intact, their tools still in place, yet the people who built them had vanished without leaving a coherent trail of what followed. By the late 19th century, gold discoveries along the Yukon River and in surrounding regions had already established a pattern of rapid settlement, followed by equally rapid abandonment. Dawson City, which rose during the Klondike Gold Rush of 1896-1899, became a central hub from which prospectors would fan outward into increasingly isolated terrain, often following river systems that functioned as both highway and obstacle depending on season and ice conditions. As surface deposits became harder to locate near established routes, many individuals pushed beyond known tributaries into areas that were not consistently surveyed or officially recorded, relying instead on informal guidance passed through trading posts, river captains, and transient mining communities. Supply records from these posts and riverboat operations document frequent outfitting of small parties heading into interior drainages, often with vague destinations described only by creek names, local landmarks, or estimated travel times rather than formal geographic coordinates. In several documented instances preserved in territorial records and expedition logs, supply drops were confirmed as received by prospecting parties who were never again recorded returning to established settlements. These entries, often brief and administrative in nature, contrast sharply with the absence of any corresponding departure documentation, a gap that reflects the fragmented nature of record-keeping and frontier logistics. The system depended heavily on seasonal river transport, handwritten manifests, and opportunistic communication between isolated camps, meaning that continuity of tracking was often assumed rather than verified. Even within those limitations, however, the repeated pattern of confirmed contact followed by complete absence remains difficult to reconcile within the surviving archival structure. The geography of Alaska's interior contributes significantly to the complexity of these cases, not only through scale, but through constant environmental transformation. The Yukon Basin alone spans thousands of miles of interconnected waterways, where seasonal freeze and thaw cycles repeatedly alter river paths, expose and erase sandbars, and reshape entire banks within a single year. Winter conditions regularly isolate interior regions for extended periods, while spring breakup renders many routes temporarily impassable or visually unrecognizable. In such environments, even minor deviations from intended travel plans could result in prolonged separation from known routes, yet the consistent discovery of abandoned camps with intact equipment suggests outcomes that extend beyond ordinary navigational failure or weather-induced delay. One recurring detail noted in multiple accounts is the condition of the abandoned sites themselves. Prospecting camps found during later return visits often contained fully assembled equipment, partially worked claims, and domestic arrangements that indicated recent and continuous habitation prior to sudden cessation. Cooking utensils, mining tools, and personal belongings were frequently left behind in organized states, sometimes positioned as if work or daily routine had paused rather than ended abruptly. In some cases, structural elements such as tents, timber frames, or crude shelters remained standing despite exposure to harsh seasonal conditions, suggesting that abandonment, if it occurred, was not immediately preceded by environmental collapse or forced evacuation. Indigenous oral histories from interior regions have occasionally referenced transient camps that appeared along established travel corridors, only to be absent upon subsequent seasonal return journeys. These accounts, while not consistently recorded within early governmental documentation, align in broad structural terms with patterns observed in settler and mining records, describing temporary human presence followed by unexplained absence without a visible trace of departure. Early administrative reports frequently excluded such testimony due to differences in methodological recording standards, yet the recurrence of similar descriptions across distinct regions introduces a parallel narrative thread that remains historically unresolved. The absence of recovered remains in many of these cases further complicates interpretation, particularly within a region where environmental conditions typically preserve at least partial physical evidence of human activity. in documented wilderness incidents across Alaska, exposure, predation, and environmental entrapment usually leave traceable indicators such as scattered equipment, skeletal remains, or identifiable survival markers. However, in several interior prospecting disappearances, no such evidence has been conclusively documented within recorded return expeditions or later surveys. This absence, combined with the presence of undisturbed camps, has contributed to long-standing uncertainty within both historical analysis and investigative review. A small number of cases revisited during later aerial surveys in the 20th century provided additional but limited insight into these earlier disappearances. Pilots conducting mapping operations over remote interior valleys occasionally reported remnants of historical mining activity, including collapsed cabins, overgrown tailing sites, and abandoned claim markers partially reclaimed by vegetation. However, ground verification of these locations rarely produced new information beyond what had already been recorded in earlier territorial surveys. Environmental reclamation and topographic change had obscured much of the original human layout, making it difficult to reconstruct precise sequences of occupation or abandonment with any certainty. As mining technology evolved and larger commercial operations replaced small independent prospecting parties, the frequency of such disappearances decreased, but earlier records remain unresolved within historical archives. Territorial documentation from the late 19th and early 20th centuries contains numerous entries noting individuals or groups last seen departing supply points without subsequent return or verified relocation. Attempts to correlate these entries with census data, death registries, or migration records have largely failed to produce consistent matches, leaving significant gaps in the continuity of recorded human movement through the interior. Environmental explanations, while often considered the most plausible framework, do not fully account for the uniformity observed across multiple independent cases. Severe weather events, wildlife encounters, and navigational errors are all well-documented hazards of interior travel, yet they typically produce secondary evidence that can later be traced or categorized. The repeated absence of such indicators in these specific instances suggests outcomes that do not align neatly with known environmental risk patterns, while at the same time, no verified evidence exists to support alternative interpretations beyond documented frontier conditions. Even modern assessments of these regions acknowledge the difficulty of reconstructing historical movement through terrain that has undergone significant natural transformation over more than a century. River courses shift, forest density regenerates, and permafrost cycles alter the visibility of older human activity, gradually erasing physical traces that once defined travel routes and settlement points. What may have once been navigable paths or clearly identifiable campsites is now often indistinguishable from surrounding wilderness, complicating any attempt to re-examine historical disappearance points with precision. What remains most striking within the collected accounts is not a single dramatic event, but the repetition of a pattern that resists closure across time, geography, and documentation systems. Small groups entered the interior with defined intent, supported by recorded supplies and mapped expectations, yet in multiple instances, the final trace of their presence is an abandoned camp preserved in stillness, as though activity simply ceased without transition or recorded conclusion. The historical record does not provide a unified explanation for these outcomes, only fragmented entries that suggest interruption without resolution. And in the deeper reaches of the interior, where river systems branch into unnamed tributaries and the forest closes around the land without interruption, there are still coordinates preserved in aging ledgers that mark places where men were last recorded moving forward into terrain that never returned them. The Mary Celeste of the Bering Sea. Commercial fishing routes in northern waters have long been shaped by narrow seasonal windows, where navigation depends as much on timing and ice behaviour as on charted distance. The Bering Sea, positioned between Alaska and the Russian Far East, has supported one of the most demanding commercial fishing environments in the world, where vessels operate under constant pressure from shifting weather systems, heavy seas, and rapidly changing visibility. Within this working maritime landscape, a recurring and unresolved pattern has emerged in official and unofficial records alike, describing vessels later discovered adrift or functioning without their crews, forming what is often referred to as the Mary Celeste of the Bering Sea, an unsolved Alaskan mystery defined not by a single incident, but by repetition across time and circumstance. Coordinated monitoring frameworks used in Alaska's offshore fisheries attempt to maintain continuous vessel tracking, even as coverage becomes less stable farther from established coastal corridors. The United States Coast Guard, alongside satellite-based monitoring systems and mandatory vessel identification protocols, oversees large portions of commercial activity, particularly in high-yield fisheries such as crab and pollock harvests. Despite these systems, gaps in continuity still exist in remote offshore zones where weather interference, equipment failure, or distance from relay infrastructure can temporarily reduce observational clarity. Within these operational boundaries, documentation of vessel movement remains extensive, yet not always sufficient to account for every anomaly that occurs far from shore. Log entries and maritime reports spanning multiple decades begin to converge on a recurring situation in which active vessels are later found unmanned while still structurally and mechanically intact. These cases do not always follow identical conditions, but they share a consistent structural absence. Ships located in operational condition, often drifting or minimally damaged, with no crew present and no verified transmission of distress before discovery. In several instances recorded within maritime incident summaries, vessels were found with engines still engaged or navigational systems still powered, suggesting that operations ceased without a documented final sequence of communication or emergency procedure. Severe weather systems in northern marine zones are capable of altering visibility and sea state within hours, yet they rarely produce conditions that fully account for the complete absence of crew aboard functioning ships. The Bering Sea is known for rapid cyclonic development, dense fog formation, and sudden wave intensification, all of which contribute to its reputation as one of the most unpredictable maritime regions in the North Pacific. However, even within documented extreme weather incidents, maritime investigations typically recover evidence of emergency response activity, abandoned equipment, or partial survival markers. The absence of such indicators in certain cases introduces an inconsistency that remains difficult to reconcile with environmental explanations alone. Recovered fishing vessels in these waters often present an unusual continuity of order, where operational settings remain unchanged and onboard arrangements suggest activity halted without procedural disruption. In some documented recoveries, personal belongings were found undisturbed, navigation charts remained open to active routes, and safety equipment was still stored in designated locations rather than deployed. This condition contrasts sharply with expected maritime abandonment behaviour, where distress situations typically produce visible signs of evacuation, damage, or rapid disorganisation. Instead, these vessels appear to have transitioned from operation to stillness without intermediate disruption, as though the final moments of human presence were not accompanied by recorded, procedural response. Maritime recovery operations in remote Alaskan regions are frequently constrained by delayed response windows and the dispersal of physical traces across dynamic ocean currents. Once a vessel is reported missing or unresponsive, search efforts must contend with vast areas of open water where drift patterns can rapidly redistribute evidence over hundreds of nautical miles. The Bering Sea's current systems, influenced by both Pacific inflow and Arctic outflow, further complicate predictive modelling of vessel movement after abandonment. As a result, even when ships are eventually located, reconstructing the precise sequence of events leading to their condition becomes an exercise limited by environmental uncertainty and incomplete temporal data. Isolated instances of abandoned vessels have appeared throughout maritime history in different oceans, though the clustering of similar reports within northern Alaskan waters forms a notably persistent regional pattern. The historical reference to the Mary Celeste discovered in the Atlantic Ocean in 1872, with its crew absent and cargo largely intact, is often invoked in broader maritime discourse, but the Bering Sea cases differ in their environmental context, regulatory oversight, and technological era. While global maritime archives contain sporadic accounts of unexplained ship abandonment, the recurrence of comparable conditions in a single geographic region introduces a concentrated focus that continues to attract both formal investigation and informal speculation. Collective analysis of these cases reveals a repeated transition from active operation to unexplained absence, documented without confirmed distress signals or verifiable accounts of crew fate. In official maritime reporting structures, the absence of communication before abandonment remains one of the most significant barriers to reconstructing events at sea, particularly in remote regions where signal coverage may be intermittent. Even when vessels are equipped with modern tracking and emergency beacon systems, recorded data does not always capture the final sequence of human decision-making before disappearance, leaving a gap between mechanical evidence and human narrative. In many of these cases, the first indication that something is wrong does not emerge from onboard distress signals, but from the absence of expected positional updates within fleet tracking systems that are otherwise designed for routine monitoring rather than real-time emergency detection. These systems operate on structured reporting intervals, meaning that a vessel can remain technically silent for a period of time before its absence is classified as irregular, creating a delay between actual onboard conditions and official recognition of potential failure. Within this delay window, uncertainty accumulates through procedural escalation rather than immediate alarm, as operators attempt to distinguish between communication disruption, equipment malfunction, and genuine operational cessation. In remote offshore zones of the Bering Sea, where environmental interference can affect signal transmission, this distinction becomes even less reliable, particularly when vessels are operating at the outer edges of coordinated fleet coverage. Maritime reconstruction efforts following these gaps rely heavily on indirect indicators, including drift modelling, last known automated positions, and sporadic contact logs from nearby vessels. However, these data points rarely align into a continuous sequence capable of fully reconstructing final onboard conditions, leaving investigators with fragmented snapshots rather than a coherent timeline of events. In several documented recoveries, physical evidence aboard vessels suggests that operational activity was ongoing shortly before abandonment, yet no corresponding communication records exist to indicate a transition into emergency protocols. This disjunction between physical state and recorded data continues to define one of the central challenges in understanding these incidents within formal maritime investigation frameworks. Far beyond the reach of coastal monitoring, certain vessels continue to appear on drift paths that suggest motion without anyone remaining aboard to alter their course. The Kennecott Shadows. Mechanical extraction systems built into the Rangel Mountains once operated through tightly coordinated phases of crushing, transport and refinement that defined one of Alaska's most complex early industrial operations. At the centre of this system stood Kennecott, a copper mining enterprise established in the early 20th century within what is now Rangel St. Elias National Park and Preserve, where steep mountain terrain and glacial isolation shaped every aspect of industrial design. The site eventually became one of the most complete preserved examples of early industrial mining infrastructure in North America, yet it also anchors an unsolved Alaskan mystery defined by the abrupt disappearance of human continuity from a fully constructed industrial environment that remains physically intact. Engineering records associated with early copper production describe an interconnected network of mills, rail lines, and processing facilities designed to function as a single continuous industrial chain. Ore was extracted from high-altitude mines, transported by aerial tramways across valleys, and processed through concentrators and reduction facilities before being moved along the narrow-gauge Kennecott Railway toward coastal shipping points. This system, remarkable for its engineering ambition in such remote terrain, required constant human coordination to maintain operational flow across multiple elevation levels and structurally isolated facilities. The scale of integration meant that disruption at any point in the chain would have immediate effects on the entire production process. Operational continuity reports from the final years of copper extraction indicate a sudden cessation of coordinated activity across multiple facilities without corresponding evidence of structural collapse or gradual shutdown. Historical production data show that Kennecott's output declined sharply in the early 1930s, coinciding with global economic instability and falling copper prices during the Great Depression. Company records document the withdrawal of operations during this period, yet the physical infrastructure was not dismantled in a manner consistent with destructive failure or environmental catastrophe. Instead, the industrial system appears to have transitioned from active use to complete dormancy in a relatively compressed time frame, leaving behind a fully formed industrial complex without its operational workforce. Structures remaining at the Kennecott site today demonstrate an unusual level of physical preservation, where industrial buildings retain their form despite the complete removal of the workforce that once maintained them. The dry, cold mountain climate contributed to the preservation of wooden and metal structures, allowing mills, bunkhouses, and processing facilities to remain visible long after their functional purpose ended. Unlike many abandoned industrial sites that deteriorate through gradual collapse or reclamation by surrounding environments, Kennecott retains a structural clarity that makes its absence of human activity more visually pronounced rather than less. The machinery is still present in form, but its operational logic has been fully disconnected from human interaction. Copper production records from the early 20th century reflect a rapid decline in output following market instability, culminating in the discontinuation of large-scale operations in the region. The closure of Kennecott operations in the 1930s is documented within industrial archives as part of a broader contraction in remote mining ventures across Alaska during the economic downturn. Equipment was reportedly removed or relocated, and key operational personnel departed as facilities were gradually decommissioned. Yet the transition was not accompanied by long-term redevelopment or repurposing of the site, leaving behind a complete industrial environment that was no longer embedded in any active production network. Administrative oversight of the site now falls under protected historic designation, where preserved industrial architecture is monitored without any continuation of its original functional purpose. Today, Kennecott is managed within Rangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve, where restoration efforts focus on stabilization rather than reactivation, allowing the site to exist primarily as a historical record of early industrial expansion in Alaska. Visitors and researchers moving through the preserved structures encounter a landscape of interconnected industrial systems that remain visually coherent, yet entirely detached from the human activity that once sustained them. The absence is not hidden by decay, it is emphasized by preservation. Industrial environments of this scale typically degrade through visible phases of abandonment, yet Kennecott presents a condition where infrastructure remains intact while human operational continuity does not. In most industrial histories, the cessation of activity is followed by structural collapse, repurposing, or gradual erasure through environmental exposure. At Kennecott, however, the sequence appears interrupted in a different way. Production ended, personnel withdrew, and the system remained physically present without transitioning into any subsequent functional stage. The result is an industrial complex that exists in full structural form but without the interpretive continuity of ongoing use or human presence. What makes this site particularly distinctive within Alaska's broader historical landscape is the way it preserves evidence of coordinated human effort, while simultaneously removing any trace of its operational continuation. The railway alignment still traces its path through mountain passes, the processing facilities still occupy their engineered positions, and the housing structures remain aligned to the logic of an active workforce that is no longer there. Unlike wilderness disappearances or maritime abandonments, nothing here is missing in physical terms. Instead, what is absent is the functional relationship between system and operator, between infrastructure and intent. Even in contemporary observation, the site presents an unusual kind of historical clarity that does not resolve its underlying discontinuity. Archaeological and preservation studies focus on structural integrity, industrial heritage, and engineering significance. Yet, none of these frameworks fully address the sense that the system remains complete without the presence that once animated it. The buildings do not suggest destruction, and the landscape does not suggest reclamation. Instead, the entire environment reflects a transition that halted at the precise point where human activity ceased to align with industrial function. Within this preserved framework, the absence of adaptive reuse becomes a defining feature of the site's historical profile. Unlike other industrial regions where abandoned infrastructure is gradually integrated into secondary economic or community functions, Kennecott retains a singular historical identity that does not transition into alternative applications. This lack of functional transformation reinforces the perception of a system that concluded in operational terms without entering a prolonged phase of environmental or social reintegration. Even now, analysis of the site relies heavily on separation between material observation and historical reconstruction, as the physical environment no longer contains active indicators of its former operational state beyond structural arrangement. The alignment of buildings, transport routes, and processing facilities continues to reflect engineered logic. Yet, the human sequences that once activated that logic are no longer recoverable through material evidence alone. What distinguishes this condition from ordinary abandonment is the persistence of completeness without continuation, where no essential component of the system is missing except the operational presence that once bound it together as a functioning whole. The remaining structures stand in a state where every visible component of production still exists, except for the presence that once gave those components their function. The bodies on the ice roads. Frozen transport corridors in Alaska emerge only under precise thermal conditions where accumulated ice thickness temporarily allows heavy vehicle passage across otherwise impassable terrain. These seasonal routes form across rivers, lakes, tundra channels, and coastal flats, creating temporary networks that function as essential logistical lifelines for remote communities and industrial operations in the far north. In this transient infrastructure, an unsolved Alaskan mystery has been recorded across multiple winters, describing instances where vehicles and their occupants entered established ice road systems and were later found absent from any confirmed point of exit, with the surface offering no sustained evidence of what occurred during the intervening interval. In official routing logs, these movements are often initially indistinguishable from routine travel until expected. Confirmations fail to appear along designated checkpoints that mark progress across long, isolated distances. Temperature thresholds governing ice road stability determine the entire structure of seasonal logistics networks that support remote industrial and community supply chains in northern Alaska. Engineers and monitoring authorities responsible for maintaining these routes rely on continuous measurement of ice thickness, load-bearing capacity, and surface integrity, as the structural reliability of the roads depends entirely on environmental stability rather than permanent construction. Weight limits are calculated with strict precision, and travel windows are enforced based on shifting climatic conditions that can alter safe passage within days or even hours. Beneath these calculations lies an operational dependency on predictability that the environment does not consistently guarantee, where minor deviations in temperature or pressure distribution across ice layers can alter the integrity of entire segments without visible warning. Operational reports associated with winter transport routes occasionally record situations in which vehicles and personnel cease to appear within expected transit windows without subsequent recovery confirmation. These records do not typically begin as indicators of disappearance, but as deviations from expected timing patterns, where scheduled arrivals fail to occur at designated checkpoints or communication intervals. In remote northern corridors, where distances between monitored points can be extensive and environmental conditions unpredictable, initial uncertainty may persist until follow-up verification becomes possible. Only after multiple confirmation attempts fail does the absence transition from delay into investigative concern. In some cases, the delay between expectation and confirmation spans a duration long enough for surface conditions themselves to change, further complicating attempts to reconstruct the original path of movement. Snow accumulation and repeated freeze-thaw cycles continuously overwrite surface-level disturbances on frozen corridors, progressively eliminating visible traces of prior movement over short temporal intervals. Unlike permanent road systems, ice roads do not retain structural memory beyond their seasonal lifespan, meaning that any imprint left on their surface is subject to rapid transformation under shifting weather conditions. Wind-driven snow can obscure tire tracks, while thermal fluctuation can alter the density and visibility of ice layers, effectively rewriting the surface without regard for prior activity. This environmental volatility introduces a condition in which physical evidence is not preserved but continuously reconfigured, leaving only short-lived impressions that can disappear before any systematic review is conducted. Recovered documentation from seasonal route monitoring indicates that surface disturbances on ice roads can exist briefly as physical impressions before disappearing entirely under renewed snowfall layers. In controlled observations of ice road environments, even recent vehicular passage can become indistinguishable from untouched surface conditions after successive weather events, particularly during periods of active snowfall or drifting accumulation. This creates a narrow evidentiary window in which movement can be visually confirmed, followed by a rapid transition into complete surface uniformity. Once that window closes, reconstruction of precise travel paths becomes increasingly dependent on indirect data sources rather than direct observation. In investigative practice, this often shifts emphasis from physical terrain analysis to reliance on recorded system outputs that may no longer correspond to visible environmental conditions. Retrieval operations in frozen terrain environments are constrained by narrow seasonal visibility periods during which surface conditions allow for safe traversal and accurate spatial assessment. Search efforts must often align with limited climatic windows when ice stability permits access to remote corridors, and even then, visibility can be compromised by whiteout conditions or shifting snow cover. In these environments, the delay between incident reporting and physical investigation can significantly alter the condition of the surface, reducing the likelihood that original disturbances remain identifiable. As a result, recovery efforts frequently rely on last known positional data rather than continuous environmental trace evidence, creating investigative frameworks that begin with precise coordinates but end in broad areas where physical confirmation is no longer possible. Infrastructure designed for winter mobility operates under conditions where its physical foundation exists only temporarily, dissolving completely once environmental thresholds shift beyond defined stability margins. Unlike engineered road systems that persist across seasons and retain structural continuity, ice roads are inherently transitional, forming and disappearing in response to temperature cycles that dictate their usability. This temporality creates a logistical framework in which entire transportation networks are effectively reconstructed each year, with no permanent physical record of prior routes remaining once thaw conditions return. Within this cyclical system, continuity exists only in planning and execution, not in material permanence, meaning that even heavily travelled corridors cannot be traced beyond their active seasonal phase. What distinguishes this phenomenon from other forms of remote travel uncertainty is the absence of residual physical continuity after surface transformation occurs. In most terrestrial environments, even when movement is disrupted or interrupted, some form of enduring trace, whether environmental alteration, structural damage, or material displacement, remains available for later interpretation. Ice road systems, however, operate under conditions where that interpretive layer can be erased through natural processes that restore surface uniformity without preserving intermediate states. This creates a unique investigative challenge in which absence is not only recorded but physically overwritten, removing not just evidence of passage but the environmental conditions that once contained it. Even technological mapping systems designed to compensate for environmental volatility encounter limitations when surface-based confirmation no longer exists to validate recorded movement sequences. Positional data may still indicate progression along a route, yet without corresponding physical markers, the relationship between recorded movement and observable terrain becomes increasingly abstract. Over time, this divergence produces a record that exists in data alone, detached from any recoverable environmental trace that might otherwise confirm or contradict it. No trace of passage across the ice roads persists in the season that follows, as though the surface itself never carried anything at all. The missing women of Anchorage and beyond. Anchorage's population density and integrated communication networks create an environment where personal movement is typically traceable through intersecting civic and transportation systems. Yet certain disappearance cases involving women remain unresolved despite this structural visibility. The city functions as Alaska's primary administrative and logistical hub, connected by highway corridors, aviation routes, and coastal access points that collectively support continuous flow between urban and remote regions. Within this interconnected framework, an unsolved Alaskan mystery has persisted in documented case records, describing instances where women reported within populated or accessible zones were later no longer traceable through any confirmed sequence of movement, despite the presence of systems designed to record and preserve such transitions. What makes these cases distinct is not isolation from infrastructure, but their occurrence inside environments where infrastructure is assumed to eliminate ambiguity. Initial missing persons filings within Alaskan law enforcement systems often originate through standardized reporting channels that prioritize immediacy of documentation over consolidated investigative assessment across jurisdictions. These filings establish the formal beginning of a case record, but they do not always reflect the complexity of subsequent investigative pathways, which may diverge depending on location, resource availability, and interagency classification protocols. In Alaska, where population centers are separated by vast distances and transportation often relies on air travel or limited road access, the initial documentation stage can occur quickly, while the transition into coordinated field investigation may unfold under varying timelines shaped by geography and weather. Over time, this separation between initial reporting and sustained investigation can introduce fragmentation into how cases are interpreted across different operational levels. Boundaries between municipal police departments, state investigative units, and regional authorities introduce procedural separation that can result in parallel case tracking without unified investigative continuity. Each entity maintains its own operational scope and documentation structure, which allows cases to progress independently within separate administrative frameworks. When a disappearance spans multiple jurisdictions or occurs near transitional zones between urban and rural regions, investigative responsibility may shift between agencies, creating intervals where case information is updated in segments rather than through a single continuous channel. This structure does not prevent investigation, but it disperses it, distributing fragments of a single case across systems that do not always merge their findings in real time. As a result, the full shape of a disappearance can become visible only through retrospective alignment of records rather than immediate synthesis. Highway corridors, aviation routes, and ferry-linked networks that connect Anchorage to surrounding regions enable rapid mobility across vast distances while simultaneously dispersing investigative focus once individuals exit centralized observation zones. These transport systems are essential to daily movement throughout Alaska, where geographic scale makes centralized monitoring impractical beyond core urban areas. Once travel extends beyond Anchorage's immediate infrastructure, tracking often depends on point-to-point confirmation rather than continuous observation, meaning that gaps between recorded locations can expand significantly depending on travel mode and timing. In such conditions, reconstructing movement becomes an exercise in linking discrete confirmations rather than observing an uninterrupted sequence. Each confirmed point establishes presence, but the absence of data between those points defines the limits of what can be reconstructed with certainty. Winter travel conditions and reduced daylight cycles in Alaska regularly extend the time required for field verification of reported locations, affecting the immediacy of search coordination without eliminating the possibility of later investigation. Seasonal limitations influence not only accessibility, but also the speed at which physical environments can be examined, particularly in regions where snow accumulation or ice formation restricts safe traversal. Even within urban-adjacent areas, weather conditions can delay ground response efforts long enough for environmental changes to alter the clarity of available surface indicators. These delays do not erase evidence directly, but they can shift the temporal relationship between reported disappearance and physical assessment. In practical terms, the environment does not conceal information intentionally, but it modifies the conditions under which information can be recovered. Active case files within missing persons databases may remain open for extended periods even in the absence of new physical evidence, maintaining investigative status through procedural retention rather than resolution milestones. This administrative persistence reflects the structure of record-keeping systems designed to preserve case continuity over time, ensuring that unresolved entries remain accessible for future review. However, the continued existence of a case file does not necessarily correspond to ongoing field activity, and in many instances investigative momentum becomes intermittent while documentation remains formally active. This creates a condition where recorded absence persists longer than investigative progression, leaving certain cases suspended in a state between active inquiry and historical record. Anchorage's role as a central urban hub introduces an additional layer of complexity, as visibility systems designed to track movement within populated regions rely on assumptions of continuity that may not hold across all forms of transit. Surveillance infrastructure, communication logs, and transportation records collectively create a framework of observational coverage, yet these systems are distributed rather than unified, meaning that data may exist across multiple platforms without immediate synthesis. In certain disappearance cases, available records confirm presence at one point and absence at another, but the interval between those points remains unaccounted for within any single investigative layer. This gap is not necessarily the result of missing data, but of data existing in separate systems that do not converge into a single interpretive sequence. environmental conditions in Alaska further shape investigative timelines, not through direct erasure of evidence, but through their influence on accessibility and observation. Extended periods of low visibility, remote terrain access limitations, and seasonal weather cycles can delay the physical examination of areas where movement is believed to have occurred. These delays introduce uncertainty not into the existence of records themselves, but into the ability to correlate those records with on-the-ground verification within a consistent timeframe. In this way, environmental factors act less as obstructive forces and more as temporal modifiers that affect when and how evidence can be confirmed. What distinguishes these cases from other forms of unresolved disappearance is not the absence of documentation, but the persistence of documentation without convergence into a complete narrative sequence. Records exist across multiple systems, yet the continuity between entry, movement, and resolution remains incomplete in select instances, leaving structured gaps within otherwise functional reporting frameworks. These gaps are not uniform, nor do they follow a single identifiable pattern, which further complicates attempts to categorize them under a singular explanatory model. Even within a system designed to observe, record, and connect movement across a vast and connected region, certain sequences of presence do not resolve into traceable outcomes. Presence is confirmed long enough to enter the record, but never extended far enough to account for what interrupts its continuation. The secret of the SS Princess Sophia dead zone. Telegraph correspondence preserved from late October 1918 begins to register escalating uncertainty surrounding the SS Princess Sophia as messages shift from routine navigation updates into fragmented situational reporting. The vessel was operating along established northern maritime routes in the Inside Passage region of Alaska and British Columbia, an area defined by narrow channels, submerged hazards, and rapidly changing coastal weather systems that could alter navigational safety within short timeframes. Within this documented sequence, an unsolved Alaskan maritime mystery emerges not from a lack of recorded information, but from the incomplete alignment of decisions, conditions, and responses that followed the vessel's final, confirmed movements. Early exchanges suggest not confusion over location, but increasing uncertainty over how rapidly environmental conditions were overtaking expected operational timelines. Meteorological summaries compiled for the Lynn Canal and surrounding Inside Passage during the same period describe rapidly intensifying storm systems that shaped navigational risk near coastal reef formations. Seasonal weather patterns in this region are influenced by funneling effects between mountain ranges and narrow waterways, often producing sudden shifts in wind strength and wave behaviour that can significantly reduce visibility and manoeuvrability. In such conditions, maritime travel depended heavily on timing and local environmental reading, where even small deviations in storm progression could determine whether passage through constrained waterways remained viable or became hazardous beyond recovery thresholds. These environmental conditions did not remain static. They intensified in cycles that compressed decision windows available to vessel operators. Shipping movement logs reconstructed from company records placed the SS Princess Sophia on a northern route segment leading toward established passage channels before its grounding on Vanderbilt Reef. The reef itself is a known navigational hazard situated within the Lynn Canal, where submerged rock formations rise near key maritime corridors used by vessels travelling between Alaska and British Columbia. According to historical accounts, the vessel's grounding occurred during deteriorating weather conditions that limited external visibility and reduced the effectiveness of navigational correction once deviation from the channel began. The sequence of events that followed is preserved in fragments across multiple documentation sources, each contributing partial clarity without producing a unified operational timeline. Even the reconstruction of the final approach remains dependent on overlapping records rather than a single continuous log. Wireless transmission archives from early 20th century maritime operations indicate irregular signal consistency that affected the continuity of real-time updates during the unfolding maritime incident. At the time, ship-to-shore communication systems were still developing in reliability and range, particularly in remote northern regions where atmospheric conditions and terrain interference could disrupt signal stability. As a result, the flow of information between the vessel and external authorities was not continuous, creating intervals where status updates were delayed or incomplete. These communication gaps became structurally significant as they influenced the timing and coordination of potential response measures during rapidly changing conditions. In practical terms, each interruption in transmission reduced the shared understanding of how quickly the situation was evolving offshore. Maritime response assessments from regional authorities documented severe storm conditions that significantly restricted safe deployment of rescue vessels during the critical hours following grounding. The environmental situation in the Lynn Canal during this period included high winds, heavy precipitation, and reduced visibility, all of which compounded the difficulty of approaching a grounded vessel positioned near hazardous reef structures. Rescue decision-making operated under constraints where operational feasibility had to be weighed against escalating environmental risk, producing delays that became increasingly consequential as conditions continued to evolve. Within this framework, response limitation was not a single decision, but a sequence shaped by shifting environmental thresholds. Each reassessment introduced new uncertainty into whether intervention was still possible under prevailing conditions. Post-incident naval inquiries and company reports present differing interpretations regarding evacuation timing and passenger survival expectations as environmental conditions continued to deteriorate. Some accounts suggest that passengers remained aboard the vessel while conditions prevented immediate evacuation, while others indicate that survival possibilities were reassessed as the situation progressed. These differences do not stem from a lack of documentation, but from variation in how recorded information was later interpreted across investigative and administrative contexts. The absence of a singular, uninterrupted operational narrative introduces ambiguity into how the sequence of decisions is ultimately understood. What is preserved are fragments of judgment made under pressure, not a unified account of how those judgments unfolded in real time. Subsequent historical analyses of the SS Princess Sophia disaster consistently highlight inconsistencies in reconstructed timelines when comparing official records with retrospective investigative interpretations. Over time, historians and maritime analysts have examined overlapping sources, including company logs, governmental inquiries, and survivor-related documentation, in an attempt to reconcile the progression of events. What emerges is not a contradiction of facts, but a divergence in how those facts connect across time-sensitive decision points. The difficulty lies in aligning fragmented records into a continuous chain of causation that fully accounts for each operational choice under rapidly changing conditions. Even minor discrepancies in recorded timestamps alter the perceived relationship between action, delay, and consequence. Complete archival records of the disaster preserve extensive detail across communication, navigation, and response stages, yet the progression between those stages cannot be aligned into a single, uninterrupted sequence of decisions. Each segment of the historical record captures a specific moment of understanding, but the transitions between those moments remain partially reconstructed rather than directly observed. In this gap between recorded events lies the central complexity of the case, where documentation exists in abundance but continuity remains structurally incomplete. The result is a historical framework that describes what occurred without fully resolving how each stage led into the next. The absence is not informational, but sequential, as though the order of understanding itself was disrupted before completion. The evidence describes every stage of what occurred, except the exact point where the understanding of what should happen next no longer held together. The last signals from the wilderness. Beacon activation records compiled through Alaska's emergency monitoring network document multiple instances in which final distress initiations occur in remote terrain before all subsequent confirmation attempts fail to produce additional response data. These records originate from a communication infrastructure designed to detect urgency in environments where human contact is limited, relying on automated systems that translate emergency activation into reliable signals across regional monitoring networks. Within this framework, an unsolved Alaskan mystery emerges not through the absence of recorded transmission, but through the abrupt cessation of response immediately after clear initiation, leaving a final signal point without a recoverable continuation. In several documented cases, the activation is strong enough to register across multiple redundant receivers, yet no corresponding follow-up handshake or cancellation sequence is ever recorded, creating an immediate structural gap between detection and resolution. Relay station logs positioned throughout Alaska's interior transmission network register intermittent reception patterns preceding the abrupt cessation of outbound communication in sparsely monitored wilderness corridors. These relay points function as intermediary nodes between isolated transmitters and centralized monitoring systems, extending communication reach across vast distances where direct connectivity is not consistently possible. In documented cases, reception appears stable long enough to confirm signal origin and strength, yet fails to maintain continuity beyond initial contact. The resulting pattern reflects not gradual degradation, but sudden interruption, where the transition from active transmission to silence is not accompanied by recorded system failure. Some relay stations even record partial signal echoes after termination, suggesting that transmission conditions persist briefly beyond the last logged message without producing usable data continuity. Orbital tracking systems operating over northern polar coverage zones capture brief positional transmissions originating from isolated regions, followed by extended periods where no further data synchronization occurs. Satellite-based monitoring relies on periodic signal exchange to maintain positional awareness, particularly in regions where ground-based infrastructure is limited or absent. When these systems register final positional pings, the data confirms presence at a specific coordinate and time, but subsequent orbital passes yield no continuation of movement or communication. This creates a documented moment of last contact that exists independently of any confirmed outcome beyond that point. In certain datasets, slight positional drift is still detected in background noise readings, though it remains below threshold levels required for verified tracking updates. Aeronautical emergency frequency logs associated with remote flight paths in Alaska register isolated distress call initiations that are not followed by sustained communication re-establishment or procedural closure signals. Aviation communication protocols typically rely on structured exchanges that include identification, position reporting, and resolution updates. In select recorded instances, distress signals originate clearly within monitored frequency ranges, yet do not progress into full procedural cycles. The absence of follow-up communication prevents reconstruction of subsequent actions, leaving only the initial emergency transmission as a verifiable reference point within flight communication archives. Radar correlation attempts in some of these cases show brief inconsistencies between expected flight progression and recorded signal termination points. Search coordination documentation maintained by regional response units shows cases where last known signal points are successfully triangulated, yet subsequent field verification produces no confirmable operational trace. These coordination efforts depend on correlating signal origin data with environmental accessibility and known movement patterns, allowing search operations to focus on defined geographic zones. However, in certain instances, triangulated locations fail to yield physical evidence consistent with the expected outcomes of signal origin. The discrepancy between precise signal location and the absence of corroborating field evidence introduces a structural gap between electronic detection and physical verification. Even repeated sweep operations in some regions produce no additional trace elements beyond the initial signal footprint. Triangulation reconstruction reports generated after communication loss attempt to stabilize final transmission coordinates, but overlapping interference patterns prevent consistent resolution of a fixed origin point. Signal triangulation in remote northern environments must account for atmospheric variability, terrain reflection, and transmission degradation, all of which can distort positional accuracy. When multiple data sources converge without producing a stable coordinate, the resulting analysis retains uncertainty within a bounded range, rather than a single fixed location. This limits the ability to define a precise endpoint for the final transmission, even when multiple systems independently register the same signal event. In some cases, recalibrated models produce slightly shifting coordinate clusters, rather than a singular resolved point. Automated transmission archives preserved through integrated monitoring systems show complete signal initiation sequences that terminate without closure markers or final acknowledgement returns. These systems are designed to log communication lifecycle stages, including activation, maintenance, and termination, ensuring that each transmission follows a recognizable structural pattern. In the cases under review, initiation and active transmission phases are fully recorded, but termination occurs without completion metadata typically associated with normal shutdown or resolution. The absence of final acknowledgement disrupts the expected continuity of the communication sequence. Some logs even retain partial metadata fragments that suggest a termination process began but was never fully executed. Cross-system transmission registries preserve synchronized timestamps marking the last active moments of communication events that end without any recorded procedural shutdown sequence. These registries compile data across multiple monitoring platforms to ensure redundancy and verification of critical communication events. Despite this redundancy, final entries consistently align with the moment of last signal activity, while failing to record the transitional process that follows. The uniformity of this absence across independent systems reinforces the structural nature of the gap, indicating that the discontinuity is not isolated but systemic in how final signals are retained. Even systems designed for fail-safe redundancy reflect the same missing interval at the same temporal boundary. Every system captures the moment a signal ends, but none of them retain what exists in the space immediately after it stops.